This is a great example of how media crafts a false narrative.
Look how many people showed up for the Civil Rights March in 1965, and for these protests against the Vietnam War and the South African apartheid. Millions of people turned out to protest the Iraq War in 2003 and Occupy Wall Street in 2010. Here's the crowd for the Women's March in 2017. And at the height of a pandemic, look how many people turned out for Black Lives Matter. Recently, millions have taken to the streets in Serbia and in Turkey and South Korea to defend their rights. This many people turn up to see Taylor Swift on a single night, and geez, look at the turnout for last year's SantaCon. But in America today,
where's everybody?
What you just saw and what you just listened to was a short piece from an editorial in the New York Times. And in that piece, the speaker is talking about all of the other historical protests in the past and how it was well attended by Americans of all stripes. And then it pivots to the events of today, since the inauguration of Donald Trump and the protests that are happening at that point. And what's being done is really insidious. What's being done in that video is that they are selectively showing sparsely attended protests since the inauguration to make the claim, or at least create the impression, that these protests aren't supported or well attended, organized, or having much in terms of momentum. And the reason why it's insidious is because this is a great example of how media crafts a version of reality that they want to see. And it's instructive in the era of Trump to watch out for these sort of things, because it's an indicator of which media outlets have decided to bend the knee and carry water for this fascist regime. Now, while the New York Times hasn't been one of the media entities that has officially bent the knee, this gives you an indication of where their editorial leanings are going. To craft a content piece that illustrates the difference in attendance, supposedly, between protests of the past and protests of today, with the intent of creating confusion and the appearance of a lack of support, is really insidious work. And it's actually completely detached from reality. When we look at the actual protests that are happening, both in physical protests and product protests, it's having an impact. You only need to look at the stock price of Tesla to know what kind of impact is being had by the economic protests that are taking place against that brand. Take a look at the stock price of Target since they made their announcements, as well as many of the other Trump-aligned organizations who have decided to bend the knee. What's happening to their businesses? Their businesses are tanking. That is a version of protest that was conveniently ignored in that piece by the New York Times. Since inauguration, there have been several protests that have been organized across state capitals all across the U.S., and there have been protests that have been lobbied at the U.S. Capitol as well. And they're not getting covered. And you know why they're not getting covered? Because those protests are largely being driven by the white majority. And the media isn't going to lend support to that because it doesn't fit the narrative that they want to advance on the behalf of the Trump administration. One of the things in the post-election aftermath that we've seen is that people of color, and specifically Black people, have decided to step back from their organizing efforts. And that has created some inconvenience for the folks who want to do a speed run into fascism and create a situation where martial law can be declared. And because these protests have not had significant people of color in attendance and leading from the front, they haven't covered it to create the spectacle that they need to justify declaring martial law. So what you're seeing within the US is an active effort to suppress the actual protests that are going on and not report on it, and creating a counter narrative that because you're not seeing much of these protests, they aren't well supported and nobody's really interested. This is a textbook example of media manipulation in order to drive a narrative that is convenient and in service of their billionaire overlords. Be aware of it, understand that it's going on, and respond accordingly. Stay in the fight.